The Cotton Club, Harlem. It was 1:37 a.m. on Friday, November 9th, 1928, approximately 26 hours after Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had returned from his week in Chicago meeting with Al Capone, when he walked into the Cotton Club on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue to celebrate his new partnership with the most powerful bootlegger in America and to begin spreading word throughout Harlem's criminal underworld that there was a new alcohol distributor in uptown Manhattan, one with connections to Chicago, with access to unlimited supplies of high-quality beer and whiskey, and with prices that would undercut every other bootlegger currently serving Harlem's speakeasies and restaurants. The Cotton Club in November 1928 was the most famous nightclub in Harlem, owned by the white gangster Oni Madden, featuring black entertainers performing for predominantly white audiences who traveled uptown from Manhattan to experience the exotic and exciting atmosphere of Harlem's nightlife, and serving as a gathering place for the criminal elite of New York, where bootleggers and numbers operators and professional gamblers mixed with corrupt politicians and crooked police officers and wealthy white socialites who enjoyed slumming in Harlem and who found the combination of great jazz music, excellent illegal liquor, and proximity to dangerous criminals to be thrilling in ways that the more refined establishments in downtown Manhattan could never match. Chicago, Illinois. It was 9:47 p.m. on Saturday, November 3rd, 1928, when Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, 23 years old, stepped off the 20th Century Limited at Union Station in Chicago, carrying a single leather valise and wearing a dark wool suit that had cost him more money than most Harlem families earned in 2 months, though considerably less than the tailored Italian suits worn by the men who'd sent the telegram requesting his presence in the Windy City. The young man, who would later be known throughout Harlem as Bumpy Johnson, had been in the criminal underworld for only 5 years, working his way up from street-level protection rackets to become one of the most trusted enforcers for the emerging numbers operations that were generating thousands of dollars weekly in Harlem's black community. But he'd never been to Chicago, had never met the legendary Italian gangsters who controlled the beer and liquor flowing across the Midwest, and had certainly never imagined that Al Capone, the most powerful and most notorious criminal in America in November 1928, would personally request a meeting with a young black enforcer from Harlem who'd barely established himself in New York's criminal hierarchy. The telegram had arrived at Johnson's apartment on West 138th Street on Tuesday, October 30th, 1928, delivered by a Western Union messenger who'd been instructed to wait for a response. The message was brief, according to William "Bub" Hewlett, Johnson's mentor and early partner in Harlem's protection rackets, who was present when the telegram arrived and who spoke with the Chicago Defender newspaper on November 8, 1928, about the events that would unfold over the following week. The telegram read, quote, "Mr. Johnson, stop your reputation in Harlem. Numbers operations has reached Chicago. Stop. Mr. Capone requests honor of your presence for business discussion of mutual benefit. Stop travel arrangements and accommodations provided. Stop. Please confirm availability. November 3rd through November 7th. Stop. Regards. Stop. Frank Nitti. Stop." End quote. Hewlett recalled that Johnson read the telegram 3 times in silence before looking up with an expression that combined suspicion with barely concealed excitement. "Who is Frank Nitti?" Johnson asked, though he already knew, because everyone involved in bootlegging and organized crime in 1928 knew that Frank Nitti was Al Capone's chief lieutenant, the man who handled financial operations for the Chicago outfit, and who served as Capone's main contact for business dealings that required discretion and careful negotiation rather than the violence and intimidation that characterized much of the beer wars that had turned Chicago into a battleground between rival gangs fighting for control of the city's illegal alcohol trade. "He is Capone's main business manager," Hewlett explained, according to his account. "This is not a small matter, Bumpy. Capone does not send telegrams to low-level operators. He does not waste time on people who cannot offer him something valuable or who cannot help him solve problems he cannot solve himself. If Frank Nitti is reaching out to you personally, it means Capone knows about the numbers rackets in Harlem, knows about the money being generated, knows that the Italian mobs in New York have not yet taken control of Harlem's policy banks the way they have taken control of bootlegging in other parts of the city, and most importantly, it means Capone sees an opportunity that involves you specifically." Johnson sent his confirmation telegram later that Tuesday evening, agreeing to travel to Chicago on November 3rd and to remain available through November 7th for whatever discussions Capone wanted to conduct. Within 48 hours, a detailed travel itinerary arrived by special courier, along with $300 in cash for expenses and a first-class ticket on the 20th Century Limited departing New York's Grand Central Terminal at 2:45 p.m. on Saturday, November 3rd, arriving at Chicago's Union Station at 9:42 p.m. the same day, one of the fastest and most luxurious passenger trains in America in 1928, a train that catered to wealthy businessmen, politicians, and celebrities who could afford the premium fares and who appreciated the polished mahogany interiors, white tablecloth dining service, and private sleeping compartments that made the overnight journey between New York and Chicago feel less like travel and more like staying at a first-class hotel that happened to be moving at 80 miles per hour across the American countryside. The trip itself was unlike anything Johnson had experienced, according to accounts he later shared with close associates in Harlem. As a young black man in 1928, he'd grown accustomed to the informal but strictly enforced racial segregation that made travel difficult, uncomfortable, and often humiliating for black Americans, who were routinely denied service at restaurants, hotels, and other establishments that catered to white customers, and who were frequently relegated to separate and inferior accommodations when they were permitted to travel at all. But the instructions that had arrived with his ticket made clear that Johnson was traveling as a guest of the Chicago outfit, and that every establishment along the route had been notified that he was to receive the same courteous and professional service extended to any first-class passenger, regardless of race. The difference was extraordinary, Johnson told Hewlett upon returning to Harlem on November 8th. I walked into the dining car, and the maitre d' greeted me by name, seated me at a table with white linens and silver cutlery, brought me a menu with steaks and chops and French wines, treated me like I was some kind of important businessman rather than a black man from Harlem who had no right to be in spaces reserved for white society. Other passengers looked at me with curiosity, some with obvious disapproval, but the staff made clear through their behavior that I was a paying customer entitled to full service, and that anyone who objected to my presence could take their complaints elsewhere. That is power, bub. Not the power to hurt people or to control territory through violence, but the power to change the rules, to make white people treat you with respect, not because the law requires it, but because someone they fear has made clear that mistreating you will have consequences they cannot afford. Johnson arrived at Union Station at 9:42 p.m. and was met on the platform by two men wearing expensive dark suits and fedora hats, one of whom introduced himself as Jack McGurn, whose real name was Vincenzo Garibaldi, a 30-year-old professional boxer turned enforcer who'd become one of Capone's most trusted and most feared gunmen, known throughout Chicago as Machine Gun Jack McGurn due to his preference for Thompson submachine guns and his involvement in numerous gangland killings that had contributed to Chicago's reputation as the most violent city in America during the beer wars of the 1920s. McGurn explained that he'd been instructed to escort Johnson to the Metropole Hotel at 2300 South Michigan Avenue, where Capone maintained offices and living quarters on the 4th floor, and where Johnson had been provided with a suite on the 3rd floor for the duration of his stay in Chicago. The ride from Union Station to the Metropole took approximately 20 minutes through streets that were crowded with Saturday evening traffic, automobiles and streetcars and pedestrians moving through a city that seemed to Johnson to be larger, louder, more industrial, and more aggressively commercial than even New York. A city where the buildings rose higher, the streets stretched wider, and the sense of energy and possibility felt somehow more raw and less refined than the relative elegance of Manhattan, though both cities shared the same undertone of violence and corruption that characterized American urban life in November 1928, 11 months before the stock market crash that would end the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties and usher in the Great Depression. The Metropole Hotel had been Capone's headquarters since 1925, when he'd moved his operations from the Hawthorne Inn in suburban Cicero back into Chicago proper, establishing himself at the Metropole with enough space to house his personal staff, his bodyguards, his business managers, and his guests in a fortress-like environment that featured armed guards at every entrance, bulletproof windows on the 4th floor, and an atmosphere of barely contained violence that made clear to anyone entering the building that this was not merely a hotel, but the command center for an organization that controlled beer distribution, gambling operations, prostitution rings, and political influence throughout Chicago and beyond. McGurn escorted Johnson to his 3rd-floor suite at 10:15 p.m. and informed him that Capone requested his presence at breakfast the following morning, Sunday, November 4th, at 9 a.m. sharp in Capone's private dining room on the 4th floor. "Be punctual," McGurn said, according to Johnson's later accounts. Mr. Capone values time and respects people who respect his schedule. He has set aside the entire morning for your meeting, which means he considers whatever business he wants to discuss with you to be important enough to give you his full attention despite the many demands on his time. Do not make him wait, do not waste his time, and do not assume that his courtesy means he is soft. Mr. Capone is the most dangerous man in Chicago, and he has killed people for less serious offenses than disrespecting his time or his hospitality. Johnson spent Saturday evening in his suite, reviewing everything he knew about Al Capone and the Chicago outfit, preparing for a meeting that could either establish him as a major player in organized crime beyond Harlem or could result in his being found in an alley somewhere with multiple gunshot wounds if he said the wrong thing or offended the wrong person. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, 31 years old, in November 1928, had been born in Brooklyn, New York, on January 17, 1899, the fourth of 9 children born to Italian immigrants, Gabriele and Teresina Capone, who'd arrived in America in 1893 seeking the economic opportunities that had drawn millions of European immigrants to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Capone had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where poverty, violence, and organized crime were facts of life for working-class Italian, Irish, and Jewish families struggling to survive in a society that viewed recent immigrants with suspicion and often hostility, relegating them to low-paying jobs and overcrowded tenements, and limiting their opportunities for advancement through legitimate channels. Like many young men in similar circumstances, Capone had been drawn into street gangs at an early age, joining the Five Points gang in Manhattan as a teenager and coming under the influence of Johnny Torrio, a sophisticated criminal organizer who recognized Capone's intelligence, ambition, and capacity for violence and who brought him to Chicago in 1919 to work for Jim Colosimo's criminal organization, which controlled prostitution and gambling operations in Chicago's South Side. When Prohibition began on January 16, 1920, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States, Torrio immediately recognized the opportunity to build a criminal empire based on providing illegal alcohol to a thirsty public that had no intention of actually stopping drinking just because the Constitution said they should. Colosimo, however, was reluctant to enter the bootlegging business, fearing that federal agents would be less tolerant of alcohol violations than they were of prostitution and gambling, and on May 11, 1920, Colosimo was murdered in his own restaurant, almost certainly on Torrio's orders, clearing the way for Torrio and Capone to build what would become the Chicago Outfit, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. By 1928, Capone had taken over from the semi-retired Torrio, who'd survived an assassination attempt in 1925 and had decided to leave Chicago for the relative safety of Brooklyn, turning control of the organization over to his protege. Capone had spent the next 3 years consolidating power, eliminating rivals, bribing politicians and police officials, and building an organization that by November 1928 controlled an estimated 20,000 speakeasies in the Chicago area, generated approximately $100 million in annual revenue according to federal estimates, employed over 1,000 people in various capacities from bootleggers to enforcers to accountants, and had made Capone himself into a national celebrity, his face regularly appearing in newspapers and magazines, his opinions sought by journalists who treated him like a legitimate businessman rather than a violent criminal who'd built his fortune through murder, extortion, and corruption. The press called him Scarface due to the prominent scars on his left cheek, the result of a knife fight during his early days in Brooklyn, though Capone himself preferred to be called Al or Mr. Capone, and most people in Chicago, knew better than to use nicknames in his presence, unless they wanted to risk offending the most dangerous man in the city. What most impressed Johnson about Capone's operation, based on everything he'd heard from contacts in New York who dealt with Chicago bootleggers, was not the violence which was commonplace in organized crime and which characterized gang operations in every major American city during Prohibition, but rather the sophistication of the organization, the way Capone had structured the outfit like a legitimate corporation with different departments handling different aspects of the business, from brewing operations to distribution networks, to political relationships, to financial management, all coordinated through a central command structure that maximized efficiency and minimized the kind of internal conflicts that had destroyed other criminal organizations. This was the man requesting a meeting with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson on Sunday morning, November 4, 1928, and Johnson spent Saturday evening trying to understand why. Sunday morning arrived cold and overcast, typical Chicago November weather, with temperatures in the low 40s and a grey sky that threatened rain. Johnson, dressed carefully in his best suit, arrived at Capone's fourth-floor private dining room at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early as a sign of respect, and was greeted by Frank Nitti, who'd been the one to send the original telegram inviting Johnson to Chicago. Nitti, 42 years old in November 1928, was a stocky, balding man with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor that contrasted sharply with the flamboyant and often loud behavior of Capone himself. But everyone in the Chicago outfit knew that Nitti was indispensable to the operation, handling the complex financial transactions, the relationships with corrupt officials, and the strategic planning that allowed Capone to focus on the public-facing aspects of leadership, while Nitti managed the details that actually kept the organization running smoothly. "Mr. Johnson," Nitti said, extending his hand for a formal handshake. "Welcome to Chicago. Mr. Capone will join us shortly. Please, have a seat, have some coffee. We have much to discuss this morning, and I suspect you are curious about why Mr. Capone asked you to travel all the way from Harlem for this meeting." At precisely 9 a.m., Al Capone entered the dining room, and Johnson later recalled that his first impression was of overwhelming physical presence, combined with unexpected elegance. Capone, in November 1928, was a large man, 5 feet 10 inches tall, and weighing approximately 250 pounds, with a round face, thick dark hair slicked back with pomade, and an expression that could shift instantly from warm friendliness to cold menace depending on the situation and his mood. He wore a custom-tailored dark grey suit that must have cost at least $500, a white silk shirt with diamond cufflinks, a burgundy tie held in place with a gold tie-pin, and polished black shoes that reflected the light from the chandelier hanging above the dining table. His left hand bore a massive gold ring, with a diamond that must have weighed at least 2 carats, and his right pinky finger wore a smaller gold ring that Johnson would later learn was a gift from Johnny Torrio, Capone's mentor and predecessor. But what struck Johnson most powerfully was not Capone's appearance, but rather the way he commanded attention simply by entering the room, the way everyone present, including Frank Nitti, Jack McGurn, and 2 bodyguards positioned near the door, immediately focused on Capone with a combination of respect, fear, and what appeared to be genuine affection, as though they were in the presence of someone who inspired loyalty through more than just intimidation, someone who'd earned their devotion through demonstrated competence, generosity to those who served him well, and an understanding of how to lead men who were themselves dangerous, violent, and ambitious. "Bumpy Johnson," Capone said, his voice friendly and warm, extending his hand for a firm handshake that Johnson returned with equal pressure, demonstrating that he was not intimidated despite being in the headquarters of the most powerful criminal in America. "Welcome to Chicago. I hope your journey was comfortable and that my people have treated you with appropriate respect. I understand that traveling as a black man in America in 1928 presents challenges that men like me do not face. And I wanted to ensure that you arrived here feeling welcomed rather than humiliated, because what I want to discuss with you requires mutual respect, trust, and an understanding that despite our different backgrounds, we have shared interests that could benefit both of us substantially if we can reach an agreement." They shared breakfast, a lavish spread of eggs, bacon, sausage, fried potatoes, toast, fresh fruit, and coffee served by 2 waiters who attended to their needs with professional efficiency, while Capone made small talk, asking about Harlem, about the jazz clubs, about the Harlem Renaissance, and the cultural explosion that had made uptown Manhattan into one of the most vibrant and exciting neighborhoods in America in the 1920s, home to writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, and a thriving black middle class that was building businesses, buying property, and establishing institutions despite the racism and discrimination that limited opportunities for black Americans throughout the country. Capone seemed genuinely interested in Harlem's cultural life, asking detailed questions that suggested he'd done his homework and understood that Harlem in 1928 was not just a black ghetto, but rather a complex community with its own economy, its own cultural identity, and its own criminal underworld that operated according to different rules and customs than the Italian and Irish gangs that dominated organized crime in other parts of New York and Chicago. After approximately 30 minutes of conversation, Capone leaned back in his chair, lit a thick Cuban cigar, and transitioned to the actual purpose of the meeting. "Let me tell you why you are here, Bumpy," Capone said, according to Johnson's detailed account of the conversation, which he shared with multiple associates upon returning to Harlem and which was documented in interviews conducted by various journalists and researchers over the following decades. "I control beer and liquor in Chicago and in much of the Midwest. I have breweries, I have distribution networks, I have speakeasies, I have relationships with Canadian suppliers, I have corrupt officials who look the other way, I have enforcers who eliminate competition, I have accountants who manage the money, I have lawyers who keep me out of prison when the federal government tries to prosecute me for tax evasion or Volstead Act violations. My organization generates approximately $100 million per year, which makes me one of the wealthiest criminals in America and certainly the most successful bootlegger in the country. But I have a problem, and the problem is that while I dominate the Midwest, I do not dominate New York, which is the largest market for illegal alcohol in the United States, a city with millions of thirsty customers and thousands of speakeasies and restaurants and hotels that need steady supplies of quality beer and liquor, and where the Italian mobs, particularly the families controlled by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, have established territorial control that makes it difficult for outside organizations like mine to operate effectively without triggering gang wars that draw unwanted attention from law enforcement and federal agents. Johnson listened carefully, saying nothing, understanding that Capone was building toward a proposition, and that interrupting would be both rude and potentially dangerous. Capone continued, "Now, I have been watching developments in Harlem with considerable interest because Harlem represents something unique in American organized crime. You have a black community that is large, relatively prosperous compared to other black neighborhoods, and that has its own criminal economy based primarily on numbers rackets, the illegal lotteries that generate thousands of dollars weekly and that are run by black operators like Madame Stephanie St. Clair, like Casper Holstein, like the dozens of smaller policy bankers who control individual territories and who have thus far operated with minimal interference from the Italian mobs that control bootlegging and other rackets in Manhattan. The Italian bosses have left Harlem's numbers rackets alone for the most part, partly because they are focused on bootlegging, which is more lucrative, partly because they do not understand the black community well enough to operate effectively there, and partly because they have not yet recognized how profitable the numbers rackets have become as Harlem's population has grown and as more black families have disposable income to spend on gambling. But that situation will not last forever. Eventually, probably within the next 5 to 7 years, the Italian mobs will decide that Harlem's numbers rackets are worth taking over, and when that happens, there will be a war, and that war will be brutal because the Italians have more men, more guns, more political connections, and more experience with large-scale organized crime than the black operators currently running the policy banks in Harlem. The question, Bumpy, is what happens to you and to Harlem's black criminal operators when that war comes? Because I do not believe you can win that war on your own, but I also do not believe you want to simply surrender Harlem to the Italians without a fight. Johnson considered this carefully before responding, and his response, according to multiple accounts, demonstrated the intelligence and strategic thinking that would later make him one of the most respected criminal leaders in New York. "You are correct that we cannot defeat the Italian mobs in a straight fight," Johnson said. "We do not have their resources, their connections, their experience with large-scale violence and intimidation, but we do have something they do not have, which is the trust and support of Harlem's black community, which views us not as outside exploiters but as our own people, criminals perhaps, but criminals who live in Harlem, who spend money in Harlem businesses, who employ Harlem residents, who sometimes help poor families when they are in desperate situations, and who are seen as less threatening than white criminals who would take money from Harlem without giving anything back to the community. That trust and that community support is valuable, especially in a neighborhood where white police officers are viewed with suspicion and hostility, where residents are unlikely to cooperate with outside investigators, and where the Italian mobs would face resistance not just from black criminals but from the entire community if they tried to impose their control through violence and intimidation the way they have done in other parts of New York. So the question is not whether we can defeat the Italians in a war, but rather whether we can create a situation where it is more profitable for the Italians to work with us as partners rather than to try to destroy us and take over our operations directly. Capone smiled broadly, clearly pleased with Johnson's analysis. "Exactly," he said. This is precisely why I asked you to come to Chicago, because you understand the situation clearly, and because you understand that the key to survival in organized crime is not just violence, although violence is certainly necessary at times, but rather creating arrangements where cooperation is more profitable than conflict. Let me tell you what I am proposing, and then you can tell me whether it interests you. What I want is access to Harlem's speakeasies, restaurants, hotels, and nightclubs for my beer and liquor. Currently, those establishments are being supplied by various bootleggers, some connected to the Italian mobs in Manhattan, some independent operators buying from Canadian sources, some making their own gin and whiskey in basement stills and bathtub operations. The quality is inconsistent, the prices are unstable, the supply is unreliable, and most importantly, there is no organization, no central control, no efficient distribution system. I can provide high-quality beer and liquor from my Chicago breweries and from my Canadian suppliers at competitive prices with guaranteed delivery schedules and product consistency. What I need is someone in Harlem who can manage the distribution, who can convince the speakeasy owners and restaurant operators to buy from my organization instead of from their current suppliers, who can handle the logistics of delivery and payment, and who can deal with any competition or resistance from operators who might not want to switch suppliers. That person would need to be someone who knows Harlem intimately, who is trusted by the black business owners who run the establishments that need alcohol, who has the muscle to enforce agreements if necessary, and who understands that working with me means becoming part of a larger organization that operates according to strict business principles rather than the chaotic and uncoordinated way that many criminal operations function. Johnson saw immediately where this was heading. "You want me to become your distributor in Harlem," he said. "You want me to take control of alcohol distribution in the black neighborhoods, to establish relationships with speakeasy owners and restaurant operators, to arrange deliveries from your Chicago operations, to collect payments, and to use my connections in the black community to build a distribution network that channels your products into Harlem while keeping the Italian mobs from interfering. In exchange, I assume you would provide me with a percentage of the profits, protection from your organization if the Italians tried to move against me, and the credibility that comes from being associated with the most powerful bootlegging operation in America." Capone nodded. "Precisely. I'm offering you an exclusive distributorship for Harlem, all of uptown Manhattan, north of 110th Street, covering the black neighborhoods that the Italian mobs have largely ignored thus far, but which represent a substantial market with thousands of potential customers. You would purchase beer and liquor from my organization at wholesale prices, approximately 40 to 50% below what Harlem speakeasies currently pay their suppliers, which means you could either undercut the current suppliers on price and rapidly take over the market, or you could match current prices and generate enormous profits for yourself, or some combination of the two strategies depending on what makes sense in different situations. I estimate that within 6 months you could control 70 to 80% of alcohol distribution in Harlem, generating weekly revenues of approximately $20,000 to $30,000, of which you would keep 30% as your profit margin after paying me wholesale cost plus 10% distribution fee, meaning you would personally be earning $6,000 to $9,000 per week, or approximately $300,000 to $450,000 per year, which would make you one of the wealthiest criminals in Harlem and certainly the most powerful bootlegger in the black community. The financial implications were staggering. Johnson, in November 1928, was earning perhaps $50 to $75 per week from his protection rackets and enforcement work for the various numbers operators in Harlem. Decent money that put him in the upper tier of Harlem's working class, but nowhere near the kind of wealth that Capone was offering. $300,000 to $450,000 per year was more money than most black families in Harlem would earn in a lifetime, and it would establish Johnson as not just a criminal operator, but as a major power broker in Harlem's economy, someone with the financial resources to buy political influence, to invest in legitimate businesses, to support community institutions, and to protect himself and his organization from law enforcement and rival criminals. But Johnson was smart enough to know that such an opportunity came with substantial risks and obligations, and he needed to understand exactly what Capone was expecting in return for this extraordinarily lucrative arrangement. "What do you want from me, besides managing distribution?" Johnson asked. "You do not offer this kind of opportunity without expecting something beyond just having a local distributor in Harlem. You could find dozens of people who could move your beer and liquor in uptown Manhattan. Why me specifically? And what else do you need?" Capone's expression became more serious, and he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his tone shifting from friendly to business-like. What I need, Bumpy, is intelligence about what is happening in New York's Italian crime families, particularly information about Masseria and Maranzano, who are heading toward a war that will reshape organized crime in New York and possibly throughout the United States. I need to know about their strengths, their weaknesses, their plans, their alliances, their conflicts, because what happens in New York affects what happens in Chicago and everywhere else, and I cannot allow myself to be surprised by developments that could threaten my organization or create opportunities I should be exploiting. You, as a black operator working in Harlem, can move through parts of New York that I cannot easily access, can develop relationships with people who would never trust an Italian from Chicago, can gather information that my normal intelligence network might miss, and can serve as my eyes and ears in New York without drawing the kind of attention that my own people would attract if I sent them to New York to gather intelligence. This is not asking you to be a spy or an informant, which would put you at risk and which would violate the code that says criminals do not cooperate with law enforcement or betray their own people. This is asking you to be a business partner who shares information that benefits both of us, who helps me understand the New York situation better, and who in return receives my support, my protection, and my business, which will make you wealthy and powerful beyond anything you could achieve on your own. There was also the matter of the future, Capone continued. Prohibition will not last forever. Already in 1928, there were growing movements to repeal the 18th Amendment, increasing recognition that prohibition had failed to reduce alcohol consumption and had instead created massive criminal enterprises, generated enormous profits for gangsters like Capone and countless others, caused thousands of deaths from poisoned alcohol and gang violence, and corrupted law enforcement and government at every level, from local police to federal prohibition agents to judges and politicians. Capone estimated that prohibition would likely be repealed within 5 to 10 years, probably sometime in the early to mid-1930s, and when that happened, the bootlegging business would collapse, the enormous revenues would disappear, and criminals who'd built their empires on illegal alcohol would need to transition to other rackets to maintain their wealth and power. The numbers rackets in Harlem would not be affected by the repeal of prohibition because gambling was already illegal and would remain illegal regardless of what happened with alcohol laws. This meant that Harlem's policy banks represented a more stable long-term criminal enterprise than bootlegging, and Capone wanted to establish relationships with black operators in Harlem now, while prohibition was still in effect and while he had the leverage and resources to offer valuable partnerships, so that when prohibition ended and the alcohol money dried up, he would already have investments and connections in other rackets that could generate ongoing revenue. By helping you build your bootlegging operation in Harlem now, Capone explained, I am also positioning myself to be a partner in your numbers operations later, when prohibition ends and when the policy banks become the primary source of income for Harlem's criminal economy. I am thinking long-term, Bumpy, building relationships and alliances that will benefit both of us for years to come, and I am offering you the opportunity to be part of something larger than just Harlem, to be connected to a national criminal organization that can provide protection, resources, and opportunities that no local operator could ever access on their own. Johnson requested time to consider the proposal, and Capone agreed to give him 24 hours to think about it, to consult with his associates in Harlem by telephone if he wished, and to ask any questions he needed answered before making a decision. They spent the rest of Sunday discussing the logistics of how the distribution operation would work, the security measures that would need to be in place to protect shipments and prevent hijacking by rival criminals, the payment systems that would ensure timely and accurate financial transactions, the communication methods that would allow Johnson and Capone's organization to coordinate deliveries and address problems quickly, and the political relationships in New York that Johnson would need to cultivate to protect the operation from law enforcement interference. Capone was thorough and detailed, demonstrating the kind of business acumen that had made him successful despite his relatively young age and his violent reputation, showing Johnson that the Chicago outfit operated less like a gang and more like a corporation, with careful planning, systematic record-keeping, and strategic thinking that extended far beyond the brutal violence that characterized Capone's public image. By Sunday evening, Johnson had a clear understanding of what Capone was proposing, what resources would be provided, what expectations would need to be met, and what the partnership would mean for his future in Harlem's criminal underworld. Johnson spent Sunday night walking through Chicago's South Side, accompanied by Jack McGurn and another bodyguard, observing the speakeasies, gambling houses, and brothels that constituted Capone's empire, seeing firsthand how the Chicago outfit functioned at street level, how the various operations were coordinated, how money flowed from customers to establishments to collectors to central management, how security was maintained, how problems were handled, and how Capone's organization maintained control over an enormous criminal enterprise that touched almost every aspect of Chicago's nightlife and entertainment industry. The scale was overwhelming, Johnson later told associates, far beyond anything operating in Harlem or anywhere else in New York. Capone had built something unprecedented in American organized crime, a truly industrial-scale operation that generated millions of dollars monthly and that operated with a level of sophistication and organization that made most other criminal enterprises look amateurish by comparison. If Johnson could bring even a fraction of that sophistication and scale to Harlem, he would become one of the most powerful criminals in New York, and the opportunities for wealth and influence would be extraordinary. Monday morning, November 5th, 1928, Johnson met again with Capone and Frank Nitti in Capone's fourth-floor office to deliver his answer. "I accept your proposal," Johnson said, according to accounts documented by multiple sources who interviewed him about the meeting in subsequent years. "I will establish distribution operations in Harlem. I will build relationships with speakeasy owners and restaurant operators. I will handle logistics and security. I will gather intelligence about developments in New York's Italian crime families. And I will work with your organization as a business partner, but I need certain guarantees from you to make this work. First, I need your commitment that you will not allow the Italian mobs in New York to interfere with my operations in Harlem. If Masseria or Maranzano or any of the other Italian bosses try to move against me or try to take over my distribution network, I need to know that you will use your influence and your resources to protect me and to make clear to the New York families that Harlem is off limits to their interference. Second, I need a direct line of communication to you personally, not just through intermediaries, so that if serious problems arise, I can reach you immediately and get decisions quickly, rather than waiting for messages to travel through multiple layers of your organization. Third, I need your commitment that the numbers rackets in Harlem will remain under the control of black operators, that your organization will not try to take over the policy banks the way the Italians eventually will, and that any future partnership in the numbers operations will be negotiated on fair terms rather than imposed through force or intimidation. And fourth, I need this agreement to be known and respected by your people and by other criminal organizations that you have influence with, so that I am not just your secret distributor in Harlem, but rather a recognized partner whose position is protected by your reputation and your power. Capone agreed to all four conditions without hesitation, and the two men shook hands to seal the agreement. Frank Nitti produced a written contract, unusual for criminal enterprises where agreements were typically made verbally and enforced through reputation and fear of retaliation rather than through legal documents that could be used as evidence in criminal prosecutions. But Capone explained that he preferred to have written agreements with important partners because written terms reduced misunderstandings and provided clarity about expectations and obligations, and because the contracts were deliberately vague enough in their language that they could not easily be used as evidence of criminal conspiracy even if they were seized by law enforcement. Johnson read the contract carefully, a two-page document that outlined the basic terms of the partnership, the financial arrangements, the territorial boundaries, and the mutual obligations, all written in language that could have described a legitimate business relationship rather than a criminal enterprise, with no specific mention of illegal alcohol, bootlegging, or any activities that violated federal or state laws. He signed the contract, using the alias Raymond Ellsworth, a reversed version of his real name that Capone suggested would provide minimal protection if the document was ever discovered, but would be sufficient for their purposes. Capone and Nitti both signed as well, using their real names because they were already famous enough that aliases would serve no purpose, and Nitti placed the contract in a safe hidden behind a painting in Capone's office, where it would remain for the next 3 years until Capone was convicted of tax evasion and imprisoned in federal prison, at which point the contract disappeared and was never seen again, though multiple witnesses confirmed its existence and general terms in interviews and testimony given over the following decades. The logistics of the operation were worked out over the next 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, November 6th and 7th, 1928, in a series of meetings with Nitti and several of Capone's logistics managers who explained in detail how the Chicago operation functioned and how Johnson's Harlem operation would be integrated into the larger network. Beer would be shipped from Chicago breweries to New York by truck, hidden in shipments of legitimate products like furniture, machinery, and food products that provided cover for the illegal cargo, with deliveries made to a warehouse in the Bronx that Johnson would rent and staff with trusted men who could receive shipments, store inventory, and prepare smaller deliveries for distribution to individual speakeasies and restaurants throughout Harlem. Liquor, which was more valuable and easier to transport than beer, would be imported from Canadian suppliers through the same routes that Capone used for his Chicago operations, with shipments coming across the border in upstate New York and then transported by truck to the Bronx warehouse for storage and distribution. Payments would be collected weekly from each establishment buying alcohol from Johnson's operation, with the money deposited in a Chicago bank account controlled by Nitty's financial managers, who would track Johnson's purchases and sales, calculate his profit share, and transfer his portion back to him through a network of intermediary accounts that made it difficult for federal investigators to trace the money, even if they suspected illegal activity. Security would be provided by a combination of Johnson's own men and additional muscle recruited from Harlem's criminal underworld, with training and support from Capone's organization to ensure that shipments were protected from hijackers and that any competitors or troublemakers were dealt with quickly and decisively. Communication between Johnson and the Chicago organization would be maintained through weekly telephone calls, monthly face-to-face meetings when Johnson traveled to Chicago or when Capone's representatives visited New York, and emergency contact procedures that allowed Johnson to reach Nitti or Capone directly if urgent situations arose that required immediate decisions. Johnson returned to New York on the 20th Century Limited on Thursday afternoon, November 8, 1928, carrying detailed plans for the Harlem distribution operation, a letter of credit for $10,000 to cover initial startup costs, including warehouse rental, equipment purchase, and hiring of staff, and a commitment from Capone to provide the first shipment of beer and liquor within 2 weeks, allowing Johnson to begin operations by the end of November 1928. The return journey gave Johnson time to process everything that had happened over the previous 5 days, to think about the enormous opportunity he'd been given and the substantial risks he'd be taking, to consider how this partnership would change his position in Harlem's criminal hierarchy and what it would mean for his future, and to begin planning how he would convince Harlem's speakeasy owners and restaurant operators to switch their alcohol suppliers from their current providers to his new operation. He understood that the key to success would be offering better prices, more reliable service, and higher quality products than the competition, combined with the credibility that came from being associated with Al Capone, whose name was known throughout America as synonymous with bootlegging success. Most speakeasy owners were business people who cared primarily about profit margins and customer satisfaction, and if Johnson could demonstrate that buying from his operation would improve their businesses, the transition would happen relatively smoothly. The few operators who resisted for personal reasons or because of loyalty to existing suppliers could be persuaded through a combination of financial incentives and carefully calibrated pressure that stopped short of violence but made clear that cooperation was in their best interests. Back in Harlem on Friday, November 9, 1928, Johnson immediately began implementing the plan he'd developed with Capone's organization. He met with William "Bub" Hewlett first, explaining the opportunity and asking for Hewlett's help in identifying reliable men who could be trusted with the sensitive work of receiving shipments, managing inventory, making deliveries, and collecting payments. Hewlett, who'd been Johnson's mentor and partner since Johnson first entered Harlem's criminal underworld in the early 1920s, was initially skeptical about partnering with a white gangster from Chicago, concerned that Capone might be using Johnson to establish a foothold in Harlem that would eventually lead to the Chicago outfit taking over the numbers rackets and other criminal operations in uptown Manhattan. But Johnson explained Capone's long-term thinking, his understanding that prohibition would eventually end and that the numbers rackets represented a more sustainable criminal enterprise than bootlegging, his commitment to respecting the territorial boundaries between his operations and Harlem's black-controlled policy banks, and his recognition that forcing his way into Harlem would be counterproductive when cooperation could be so much more profitable for everyone involved. Hewlett remained cautious, but agreed to support the venture, and together they began recruiting the dozen men who would form the core of Johnson's distribution operation, all of them young, ambitious, and hungry for the opportunity to be part of something larger than the small-scale protection rackets and enforcement work that constituted most criminal employment in Harlem in 1928. By mid-November, Johnson had rented a warehouse on Brook Avenue in the South Bronx, just across the Harlem River from Upper Manhattan, a location that provided easy access to Harlem while being far enough from the center of black neighborhoods to avoid drawing too much attention from residents or police. The warehouse, a two-story brick building that had previously been used for furniture storage, offered approximately 5,000 square feet of space on the ground floor for inventory storage and a smaller second-floor office area where Johnson could manage paperwork and conduct meetings. He equipped the warehouse with reinforced doors and windows, hired 2 armed guards to provide 24-hour security, installed a telephone line for communication with suppliers and customers, and purchased a truck for making deliveries to speakeasies and restaurants throughout Harlem. The total startup costs came to approximately $8,000, leaving $2,000 from Capone's initial funding for working capital to cover early operational expenses before revenue from sales began flowing in. Johnson hired a bookkeeper, a middle-aged black man named Theodore Green, who'd worked as an accountant for legitimate businesses in Harlem and who understood how to maintain financial records that looked legitimate on the surface while hiding the illegal nature of the enterprise underneath layers of paperwork and false invoicing, and Green established the accounting systems that would track inventory, record sales, calculate profit margins, and prepare the financial reports that Johnson would send to Frank Nitti in Chicago on a monthly basis to document the operation's performance. The first shipment from Chicago arrived on Monday, November 26, 1928, 2 weeks after Johnson's initial meeting with Capone, delivered by truck in the early morning hours when traffic was light and when the chances of police interference were minimal. The shipment consisted of 250 cases of beer and 50 cases of whiskey, a relatively modest initial load designed to test the distribution system and to give Johnson enough product to begin approaching potential customers without overwhelming his still-developing operation. The wholesale cost for the shipment was $4,500, paid in advance from the startup funds Capone had provided, and Johnson calculated that if he sold the beer at standard Harlem speakeasy prices, his retail revenue would be approximately $12,000, generating a gross profit of $7,500 before accounting for operating expenses, of which approximately $2,250, or 30%, would be his personal profit as specified in the agreement with Capone. That meant the first shipment alone, if sold completely, would generate more money for Johnson personally than he typically earned in an entire month from his protection rackets and enforcement work, and that was just the beginning because once the operation was fully established and handling multiple shipments per week, his monthly income would increase to levels that would make him one of the wealthiest criminals in Harlem and certainly the richest black bootlegger in New York. Johnson spent the final week of November 1928 making the rounds of Harlem's speakeasies, introducing himself to owners and managers, explaining that he had a new source for high-quality beer and liquor at prices below what they were currently paying, demonstrating the product quality by offering free samples, and patiently building the relationships and trust that would be necessary to convince established businesses to change their suppliers. His pitch was simple and effective, according to accounts from speakeasy owners who later discussed the early days of Johnson's distribution operation. He would walk into an establishment, introduce himself politely, explain that he represented a new distribution company with connections to quality suppliers in Chicago and Canada, and offer to provide beer and liquor at prices that were typically 10 to 20% below what the speakeasy was currently paying. He would leave samples of the beer and whiskey, asking the owner to compare the quality with what they were getting from their current supplier, and he would return a few days later to see if they were interested in placing an order. There was no hard sell, no intimidation, no threats of violence or suggestions that refusing his offer would lead to problems, just straightforward business propositions based on better prices and better quality. This approach worked remarkably well with most speakeasy owners, who were business people looking to maximize their profits, and who didn't particularly care where their alcohol came from as long as the price was right, the quality was good, and the deliveries were reliable. By mid-December 1928, approximately 6 weeks after Johnson's meeting with Capone in Chicago, the Harlem distribution operation was servicing 32 speakeasies and restaurants, generating weekly sales of approximately $6,000 and weekly profits for Johnson of approximately $1,800, or roughly $93,600 per year if the business continued at that rate. But Johnson was not content with this level of success, and he continued aggressively expanding the operation throughout December and into early 1929, adding new customers weekly, increasing the volume of shipments from Chicago, and building a reputation as the most reliable and professional alcohol distributor in Harlem. His operation stood out from the competition because of its consistency and professionalism. Deliveries happened on schedule, the product quality was uniform and high, the pricing was fair and competitive, and when problems arose, such as damaged shipments or inventory shortages, Johnson handled them quickly and fairly, sometimes absorbing small losses himself rather than passing them on to customers, building goodwill and loyalty that would pay off in the long term as word spread through Harlem's speakeasy owners that Johnson's operation was the best supplier to work with. By March 1929, just 4 months after starting the operation, Johnson was servicing 75 speakeasies and restaurants in Harlem, generating weekly sales of approximately $15,000 and weekly profits of approximately $4,500, or roughly $234,000 annually. This made him one of the wealthiest black criminals in New York, surpassing even some of the major numbers operators whose policy banks had been generating profits for years. More importantly, the success of the alcohol distribution operation gave Johnson credibility and influence within Harlem's criminal underworld that he'd never had before, and speakeasy owners who bought beer and liquor from his operation began asking him to help them with other business problems, from dealing with protection racket operators who were demanding excessive payments to resolving disputes with employees or customers to providing informal security services that kept troublemakers away from their establishments. Johnson understood that these requests represented opportunities to expand his influence beyond just alcohol distribution, and he began offering a broader range of services to the businesses he supplied, positioning himself not just as a bootlegger, but as a problem solver and protector for Harlem's entertainment industry, someone who could be called on when issues arose that required discretion, connections, or occasionally the threat of violence. The intelligence function that Capone had requested as part of their agreement also proved valuable, though in ways that neither Johnson nor Capone had fully anticipated in November 1928. As Johnson built relationships with speakeasy owners, restaurant operators, and other business people throughout Harlem, he gained access to information about what was happening in New York's Italian crime families, because many of the people he dealt with also had connections to Italian bootleggers, to corrupt police officers and politicians who worked with the Italian mobs, and to the various intermediaries and facilitators who moved through multiple criminal worlds and who picked up gossip and rumors and useful intelligence about mob activities, territorial disputes, upcoming gang conflicts, and law enforcement investigations. Johnson began compiling this information in weekly reports that he sent to Frank Nitti in Chicago, careful to distinguish between verified facts and unconfirmed rumors, to identify his sources when possible so that Nitti could assess their reliability, and to highlight information that seemed particularly important or timely. By mid-1929, these intelligence reports had become one of Capone's most valuable sources of information about developments in New York, supplementing the intelligence he received from his own operatives and providing perspectives and details that came from the black community and from the parts of Harlem's economy that white investigators and informants could not easily access. One of the most significant pieces of intelligence Johnson provided to Capone came in September 1929, approximately 10 months after their initial meeting in Chicago, when Johnson's sources indicated that tensions between Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano were escalating toward open warfare. The two Italian bosses had been rivals for years, competing for control of New York's bootlegging operations, gambling rackets, and other criminal enterprises. But by late 1929, the competition had become increasingly violent, with both sides recruiting soldiers, stockpiling weapons, and making alliances with other criminal organizations in preparation for what would eventually become the Castellammarese War, a bloody conflict that would reshape organized crime in New York and that would ultimately lead to the creation of the five families structure that governed Italian-American organized crime for decades thereafter. Johnson's report to Capone in September 1929 provided detailed information about which gang leaders were aligning with Masseria and which were supporting Maranzano, what resources each side had assembled, what strategies they appeared to be planning, and how the coming war might affect bootlegging operations and criminal activities throughout New York. Capone used this information to position his own organization advantageously, maintaining neutral relationships with both Masseria and Maranzano, selling beer and liquor to supporters of both sides, and preparing to take advantage of whatever power vacuum might emerge when the war finally started, and when casualties and disruption created opportunities for outside operators to expand their influence in New York's criminal underworld. The partnership between Johnson and Capone continued to develop and strengthen throughout 1929 and into 1930, with Johnson's Harlem distribution operation expanding to serve over 120 establishments by the end of 1930, generating annual revenues of approximately $800,000 and annual profits for Johnson personally of approximately $240,000, making him one of the wealthiest black men in Harlem and certainly the richest black criminal in New York. But more important than the money was the position of power and influence that Johnson had established within Harlem's economy and criminal underworld. He was no longer just a young enforcer working for other people's operations. He was now a boss in his own right, someone who controlled a substantial business enterprise, who employed dozens of men in various capacities, who had relationships with politicians and police officials who could be bribed or influenced, who was connected to the most powerful bootlegger in America, and who was building the foundation for what would eventually become a criminal empire that would dominate Harlem for the next 4 decades. Speakeasy owners who bought alcohol from Johnson's operation began consulting him about business decisions, seeking his advice about expansion plans or personnel problems, or how to deal with corrupt officials who were demanding excessive payoffs. Community leaders in Harlem, including ministers and businessmen and political organizers, began approaching Johnson for financial support for various causes and projects, recognizing that he had money and that he cared about Harlem's black community and that supporting churches, schools, and charitable organizations was good for his reputation and helped maintain the goodwill that allowed him to operate relatively freely, despite the illegal nature of his enterprises. The long-term impact of the Johnson-Capone partnership on Harlem proved to be even more significant than either man could have anticipated in November 1928. The bootlegging operation that Johnson established provided him with the capital, the organizational experience, and the criminal credibility that he would need when he moved into other rackets in the 1930s, particularly the numbers operations that would become his primary focus after Prohibition ended in 1933. The relationship with Capone also gave Johnson protection from the Italian mobs in New York during the critical period when they were fighting among themselves during the Castellamarese War, and when they might otherwise have tried to take over Harlem's criminal economy, if not for the understanding that Harlem was associated with Capone's organization and that interfering with Johnson would mean creating problems with Chicago. This protection allowed Johnson and other black operators in Harlem to build their organizations and consolidate their power during the early 1930s, establishing themselves firmly enough that when the Italian mobs finally did try to move into Harlem in the mid-1930s, particularly when Dutch Schultz attempted to take over the numbers rackets, the black operators were strong enough to fight back and to negotiate arrangements that allowed them to maintain significant autonomy and control rather than being completely subordinated to Italian control the way black criminals in other cities were often forced to accept. Perhaps most importantly, the partnership demonstrated to Johnson and to other black criminals in Harlem that it was possible to build large-scale criminal enterprises to compete successfully with white gangsters who had traditionally dominated organized crime, to establish businesses that generated serious money and real power, and to create organizations that operated according to professional business principles rather than the chaotic and often self-destructive patterns that characterized many small-time criminal operations. The lessons Johnson learned from observing Capone's organization in Chicago in November 1928, the systems and structures that he implemented in his Harlem distribution operation throughout 1929 and 1930, and the experience of managing a complex criminal enterprise that involved logistics, finance, personnel management, customer relations, security, and political relationships all prepared him for the larger role he would play in Harlem's criminal underworld in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when he would become known as Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, one of the most powerful and most respected black criminals in American history. The partnership between Johnson and Capone lasted until Capone's conviction for tax evasion in October 1931 and his imprisonment in federal prison, at which point control of the Chicago outfit passed to Frank Nitti and other lieutenants who maintained the business relationship with Johnson, but without the same personal connection and mutual respect that had characterized the original agreement. When Prohibition ended in December 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, the bootlegging business collapsed almost overnight, and Johnson's alcohol distribution operation, like bootlegging operations throughout America, lost its primary source of revenue. But by that time, Johnson had already transitioned much of his energy and resources to the numbers rackets, taking advantage of the organizational skills and business experience he'd developed during his 4 years as Harlem's leading black bootlegger to build a policy banking operation that would generate steady income for decades, that would survive the attempts by Dutch Schultz and later by the Italian mob families to take over Harlem's numbers rackets, and that would make Johnson into a legend, a figure whose name would be synonymous with Harlem criminal power, whose story would inspire books and movies and television series, and whose influence would extend far beyond the criminal underworld to touch politics, culture, and community life in Harlem throughout the mid-20th century. Looking back from the vantage point of decades later, the November 1928 meeting between Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson appears as one of those pivotal moments in history when decisions made by a few individuals in private conversations changed the course of events for an entire community. What Capone offered Johnson was not just a business opportunity, but a vision of what black criminals could achieve if they operated with the same sophistication and organization that characterized the most successful white gangsters. And what Johnson demonstrated by building a successful distribution operation in Harlem was that black operators could compete at the highest levels of organized crime, could manage complex businesses, could build organizations that generated serious revenue, and could earn the respect of powerful white criminals who judged them based on competence and results rather than on race. This was revolutionary in 1928 America, a country where black people were systematically excluded from most economic opportunities, where racist assumptions about black inferiority were widely accepted even among otherwise intelligent people, where the criminal underworld was one of the few areas where ambitious black men could sometimes achieve power and wealth despite the obstacles placed in their way by a racist society. Capone saw past the racial prejudices of his time, recognized talent and potential in a young black enforcer from Harlem, and offered him an opportunity that changed his life and that ultimately changed Harlem itself. The story of how Al Capone made a deal with Bumpy Johnson in 1928 became part of Harlem's oral history, a tale told and retold in speakeasies and policy banks and on street corners, a story that grew in the telling and that acquired legendary status as the years passed, and as Johnson's reputation grew from promising young criminal to established boss to legendary godfather of Harlem. Some versions of the story emphasized the mutual respect between the two men, the way Capone treated Johnson as an equal despite the racial hierarchies that governed American society in 1928. Other versions focused on the business acumen that both men demonstrated, the careful planning and strategic thinking that turned a simple distribution agreement into a partnership that lasted for years and that generated enormous profits for both sides. Still, other versions highlighted the impact the partnership had on Harlem, the way it protected the black community from the worst excesses of Italian mob control, the way it allowed black criminals to maintain autonomy and power in their own neighborhoods when black operators in other cities were being subordinated to white criminal organizations, and the way it demonstrated that black people could build and manage sophisticated criminal enterprises that competed successfully with the best white gangsters in America. Years later, in 1964, when Bumpy Johnson had become one of the most powerful criminals in New York, and when his wife and daughter would be publicly humiliated in a Fifth Avenue boutique by a racist white businessman, the connections and skills and resources that Johnson would use to systematically destroy that businessman's empire would trace their origins back to lessons learned from Al Capone in November 1928. The understanding of how to build business relationships, how to leverage connections for maximum effect, how to coordinate multiple simultaneous actions to create overwhelming pressure, how to use legitimate business mechanisms as weapons against enemies, how to operate with sophistication and planning rather than just crude violence. All of these capabilities that Johnson would demonstrate in 1964 had their roots in what Capone taught him in 1928, in the systems and methods and strategic thinking that Capone shared with the young Bumpy Johnson during their meetings in Chicago, and that Johnson adapted and refined over the following decades as he built his own criminal empire in Harlem. The legacy of the Capone-Johnson partnership extended well beyond the two men themselves, shaping organized crime in Harlem for generations, establishing precedents for cooperation between black and white criminals that would influence how different ethnic groups interacted in the criminal underworld, and demonstrating that black operators could achieve success at the highest levels of organized crime if they were given opportunities and if they had the talent and determination to capitalize on those opportunities. The partnership also illustrated one of the fundamental truths about organized crime in America, that criminal enterprises often demonstrated more racial integration and cooperation than legitimate businesses and institutions in the same era, because criminals judged each other based on competence, reliability, and the ability to generate revenue rather than on skin color or ethnic background, and because the illegal nature of their activities forced them to form alliances and partnerships that crossed racial and ethnic lines in ways that would have been unusual or impossible in the legitimate economy of 1928 America. Al Capone, despite being a product of his time and certainly not immune to the racial prejudices that characterized American society in the 1920s, recognized talent when he saw it, understood that working with Bumpy Johnson would be more profitable than excluding him based on race, and made a business decision that reflected the pragmatic and opportunistic nature of successful criminals who cared more about making money than about maintaining artificial racial hierarchies. For Harlem, the impact of what happened in November 1928 was transformative, though the full effects would take years to become apparent. The bootlegging operation that Johnson established with Capone's support brought organization, professionalism, and substantial capital into Harlem's criminal economy at a critical moment when the neighborhood was growing rapidly, when the Harlem Renaissance was attracting national attention to the cultural and intellectual achievements of Black Americans, and when the numbers rackets were generating increasing amounts of money that could be used to build criminal organizations capable of resisting outside control. The protection that Capone's support provided allowed Harlem's black operators to develop their own organizations during the late 1920s and early 1930s, to build the infrastructure and the expertise and the political connections that would be necessary when the Italian mobs eventually tried to take over Harlem's rackets, and to establish themselves as forces to be reckoned with rather than as small-time criminals who could be easily pushed aside by more powerful white gangsters. When Dutch Schultz came to Harlem in the mid-1930s demanding control of the numbers operations, he found himself confronting not a disorganized collection of individual policy bankers, but rather a relatively cohesive group of black criminals who had resources, organization, political connections, and the backing of important figures like Bumpy Johnson, who by that time had used the wealth and experience from his bootlegging years to establish himself as one of Harlem's most powerful operators. The resistance that Schultz faced, the negotiations that eventually resulted in black operators maintaining some autonomy even after Italian involvement in the numbers rackets increased, and the fact that Harlem never became completely subordinated to Italian control the way that other black neighborhoods in New York and other cities did, all of these outcomes can be traced in part to the foundation that was laid when Al Capone decided to partner with Bumpy Johnson in November 1928, rather than trying to take over Harlem through force or through proxies. The story also illustrates the complex and often contradictory nature of criminal leadership in American urban communities during the early 20th century. Bumpy Johnson was simultaneously a violent criminal who hurt people, an exploiter who made money from illegal gambling that often took money from poor families who could not afford to lose, and a community figure who helped residents when they were in trouble, who supported churches and schools and charitable causes, who employed Harlem residents and spent money in Harlem businesses, and who was seen by many in the black community as a protector against outside exploitation, even though he was himself exploiting the community through his criminal activities. This dual nature, the capacity to be both predator and protector, both criminal and community leader, characterized many of the most successful black gangsters in the era before the civil rights movement opened up more legitimate opportunities for black economic advancement. And it reflected the reality that in communities where legitimate economic opportunities were severely limited by racism and discrimination, criminal enterprises were sometimes the only available paths to wealth and power, and criminal leaders were sometimes the only people with sufficient resources and influence to challenge the white power structures that controlled most aspects of urban life in segregated America. Al Capone's role in this story is equally complex and contradictory. He was a brutal killer responsible for numerous murders, a corrupter of public officials who undermined democratic governance, an organizer of prostitution and gambling operations that exploited vulnerable people, and a tax cheat who made a fortune while ordinary Americans struggled through the Great Depression. But he was also a shrewd businessman who recognized talent regardless of race, a strategic thinker who understood that cooperation could be more profitable than conflict, and someone who was willing to take a chance on a young black criminal from Harlem at a time when most white gangsters would have dismissed Johnson as beneath their notice or would have tried to exploit him rather than partnering with him as an equal. The fact that Capone treated Johnson with respect, that he shared business knowledge and organizational expertise, that he protected Johnson's operation from interference by Italian mobs in New York, and that he honored the terms of their agreement for as long as he remained free and in control of the Chicago outfit. All of these actions demonstrated a capacity for fairness and honor within the criminal world that stood in stark contrast to the violence and ruthlessness that characterized other aspects of Capone's career. This complexity, the coexistence of brutality and business acumen, of violence and honor, of exploitation and generosity, was characteristic of the most successful criminals in the Prohibition era, and it helps explain why figures like Capone and later Johnson himself became legendary, because they represented something more than just criminals. They represented a kind of alternative American success story, outsiders who built empires through intelligence and determination, and who achieved wealth and power despite starting from disadvantaged positions in a society that was structured to limit their opportunities. The November 1928 meeting between Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson thus stands as one of the formative moments in the history of organized crime in Harlem and in the development of black criminal enterprise in America. What began as a business discussion about bootlegging distribution evolved into a partnership that lasted for years, that generated enormous profits for both men, that protected Harlem's black criminal operators during a critical period of growth and consolidation, that demonstrated the possibilities for black achievement in organized crime at the highest levels, and that established foundations and precedents that would shape Harlem's criminal economy for decades to come. The deal that Al Capone made with Bumpy Johnson in 1928 changed Harlem forever, not through any single dramatic event, but rather through the accumulation of consequences that flowed from that initial agreement, through the organizations that were built, the relationships that were forged, the skills that were developed, the capital that was accumulated, and the vision that was shared between a legendary white gangster from Chicago and a young black criminal from Harlem who would himself become a legend, the godfather of Harlem, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, whose story began in many ways on that cold November evening in 1928, when he stepped off the train in Chicago and walked into a meeting that would change his life and change Harlem and change the trajectory of black organized crime in America.